master left me with his newborn. Years later, he could not face the slave who became my strength. He rode away without once looking back. He placed his newborn son into her arms and spoke only a single sentence before disappearing into the gray morning light. No promise, no date of return, only silence and dust hanging in the air. Everyone on the plantation believed she would fall apart. A young white mistress alone, with a baby in a house full of whispers. But what no one expected was this: the one person who remained, a young enslaved man, with quiet eyes and steady hands. Years later, when the master finally returned, he did not fear his wife. He feared the man who had become her strength. This story happens in the early 1800s on a quiet cotton plantation far away from the busy towns. It is about a love that was never supposed to exist, about secrets kept behind closed doors, and about courage that grew in the middle of suffering. It is not only about romance, it is about loyalty, sacrifice, and the kind of connection that forms when two lonely hearts stand side by side against the world. Now, let me share this story. If you enjoy stories like this, do not forget to like and subscribe to the channel. The year was 1847. The Carter plantation stood wide and proud beneath the southern sun. Tall white columns supported the big house, and rows of cotton stretched as far as the eyes could see. Inside that house lived Evelyn Carter, only 22 years old, already carrying more sadness than most twice her age. Her husband, Thomas Carter, was a strict and distant man who cared more about land and reputation than about feelings. One cold morning, Thomas placed their newborn son into Evelyn's arms. "I have business in New Orleans," he said in a flat voice. "I will return when it is settled." He did not kiss her goodbye. He did not touch his child. He simply turned and left. Days passed into weeks. Weeks slowly became months. No letters arrived. The house felt empty, even though it was filled with workers and servants. Among them was Isaiah, a young black man with strong shoulders and calm, thoughtful eyes. He worked in the fields, but he often carried firewood up to the house. He noticed how pale Mrs. Carter had become. He noticed how she struggled to keep herself together, and slowly, without either of them planning it, something began to shift. The days grew longer as summer settled over the Carter plantation. The sun rose early and stayed high, pressing its heat into the fields and into the walls of the big house. Life continued, but inside that house, something quiet and delicate was beginning to grow. Evelyn Carter had learned to hide her fear. In front of the house servants, she stood straight. She gave gentle orders. She held her baby boy Samuel close to her chest and tried to appear strong. But at night, when the lamps burned low and the crickets sang outside her window, she would sit alone in the rocking chair and stare at the door, hoping it would open. It never did. Thomas Carter had been gone nearly a year. The overseer managed the fields. The house servants followed their routine, but without Thomas, the plantation felt uncertain. Rumors began to move quietly among the workers. Some said the master had fallen into gambling debt. Others whispered that he had found comfort in another woman in New Orleans. Evelyn did not hear the full stories, but she felt them in the way people looked at her with pity. The only person who did not look at her with pity was Isaiah. Isaiah had been brought to the plantation at 15. Now he was 24. Tall, quiet, dependable. He spoke only when necessary. He worked hard and kept his head lowered, but he noticed everything around him. One afternoon, Evelyn stepped outside carrying Samuel. The baby would not stop crying. The heat felt unbearable. She became lightheaded. Isaiah was stacking wood nearby. He saw the color drain from her face. "Ma'am," he said softly, keeping his eyes lowered, "you should sit in the shade." She tried to dismiss him, but her knees trembled. Before she could collapse, Isaiah stepped forward, careful and respectful, steadying her without touching more than he needed to. For a brief moment, their eyes met. There was no fear in his gaze, no judgment, only concern. That small moment changed something between them. After that day, Isaiah found quiet ways to help. When Samuel cried in the middle of the afternoon, Isaiah would finish his field work early and carry cool water to the house porch. When strong winds shook the windows at night, Isaiah checked the shutters without being asked. He never stepped beyond his place. He never spoke out of turn, but his presence became something solid, something Evelyn could rely on. One evening, as the sun turned the sky orange, Evelyn sat on the back steps while Samuel slept inside. Isaiah was repairing a broken fence nearby. "You have family?" she asked softly. He paused, surprised she had spoken to him in such a personal way. "Yes, ma'am," he answered. "I had a mother. She passed away some years ago." "I am sorry," she whispered. He nodded once. Silence stretched between them, but it did not feel uncomfortable. "My husband used to sit there," she said after a moment, pointing to the far end of the porch, "before the baby was born." Isaiah did not respond. He knew better than to speak about the master. "I thought marriage meant partnership," she continued quietly. "But sometimes I feel like I was only part of the furniture." Isaiah looked down at the dirt near his boots. He chose his words carefully. "You deserve better than feeling alone." The words escaped before he could stop them. Both of them became still. A line had nearly been crossed. Isaiah stepped back quickly. "Forgive me, ma'am." But Evelyn did not look angry. She looked touched. "Thank you," she said gently. As the months passed, Samuel began to crawl, then stand on shaky legs. The boy's laughter filled the house. He reached for Isaiah whenever he saw him. At first, Evelyn felt uneasy about it. It was not proper. People would talk, and people did talk. The housemaid, Clara, noticed how Isaiah lingered a second longer on the porch. The overseer noticed how Evelyn's eyes softened whenever Isaiah carried Samuel. Whispers spread like dry leaves in the wind. One afternoon, Clara approached Evelyn carefully. "Ma'am," she said, wringing her hands, "folks are starting to wonder." "Wonder what?" Evelyn asked, though she already understood. Clara hesitated. "About you and Isaiah." Evelyn's face grew warm, shame mixed with anger. "There is nothing improper," she said firmly. "He has been nothing but respectful." "Yes, ma'am," Clara agreed quickly. "But the world does not need truth to start trouble." That night, Evelyn lay awake thinking. She understood the rules of the world she lived in. A white mistress and an enslaved man, even standing too close, could mean danger, not only for her, but for him. Isaiah could be punished or worse. The thought tightened her chest. The next morning she called Isaiah aside. "You must not come to the porch anymore unless I call for you," she said, forcing her voice to remain calm. He did not argue. He did not appear confused. "Yes, ma'am," he answered quietly. But something in his eyes faded. For several days after that, the house felt colder. Late that summer, a violent storm rolled over the plantation. Thunder shook the earth. Rain poured down in heavy sheets. One of the old oak trees near the back of the house split and fell, crushing part of the stable roof. Horses screamed in fear. Without hesitation, Isaiah ran toward the stable. Rain soaked his shirt as he pulled open the broken doors and calmed the frightened animals. Inside the house, Samuel began crying loudly at the sound of thunder. Evelyn tried to soothe him, but lightning struck nearby and the entire house trembled. Panic rose inside her. She rushed outside without thinking, holding Samuel tightly, searching for help. The wind nearly knocked her to the ground. Isaiah saw her struggling through the rain. "Get back inside," he shouted over the storm. "I cannot calm him," she cried. Isaiah ran toward her. For the first time, he did not think about rules or boundaries. He wrapped one strong arm around her shoulders to steady her against the wind, while using his other hand to shield the baby's face from the rain. "Trust me," he said firmly. His voice was steady and sure. She trusted him. Together, they made it safely back inside. Inside the house, drenched and shaking, Evelyn looked at him in a way she had never allowed herself to before, not as mistress and slave, not divided by law, but as two people who had just protected a child together. "Thank you," she whispered. Isaiah stepped back at once, remembering his place. "I only did what was right," he said. But something had shifted again, deeper and stronger this time. 2 weeks after the storm, a letter arrived. The seal carried Thomas Carter's name. Evelyn's hands trembled as she opened it. "I will be returning before winter," it read. "Prepare the house." That was all. No apology, no explanation, only his return. Evelyn felt her heart pound. After nearly 2 years, he was coming back. She stepped onto the porch where Isaiah was repairing the railing. "He is returning," she said quietly. Isaiah paused. "When?" "Before winter." A long silence followed. The air between them felt heavier than ever. Everything they had carefully built, the quiet trust, the shared glances, the strength they gave one another, suddenly stood on fragile ground. Isaiah nodded once. "Then we best make sure everything is in order." His voice was calm, but inside something tightened. He knew that when Thomas Carter returned, he would not only see his wife, he would notice the way his son reached for Isaiah. He would see how Evelyn stood a little taller when Isaiah was near, and some men could not bear that. The sun slowly set behind the cotton fields, painting the sky a deep red. Winter was approaching, and with it, the master. Winter arrived early that year. The air turned sharp, and frost covered the cotton fields like a thin white blanket. The Carter plantation looked peaceful from a distance, calm and still. But inside the big house, every step felt heavy. Thomas Carter returned on a gray afternoon. The sound of horses came first, then the crunch of carriage wheels over frozen ground. The house servants froze where they stood. The overseer straightened his coat. Evelyn waited at the front door, Samuel in her arms. When Thomas stepped down from the carriage, he looked older and harder. His coat was expensive, his expression cold, and his eyes sharp as they lifted toward the house. Boots polished, but his eyes were cold and searching. He did not smile when he saw his wife. He looked at the house first, then at the land, measuring everything. Only after that did he glance at the child in her arms. "That is him?" he asked flatly. "Yes," Evelyn answered softly. "Your son." Thomas stepped closer. Samuel reached outward, but not toward his father. The child twisted in Evelyn's arms, peering past Thomas's shoulder. "Isaiah," Samuel called happily. The yard grew still. Thomas turned slowly. Isaiah stood near the stable holding a bundle of firewood. He had stopped walking the moment the carriage rolled in. Thomas's eyes narrowed. "Why does my son call for him?" he asked. Evelyn felt her heart begin to pound. "He helps around the house. Samuel sees him often." Thomas looked at Isaiah again, this time longer, more carefully. Something dark shifted behind his eyes. That evening the house felt as if it were holding its breath. Thomas sat at the head of the dining table. Evelyn sat across from him. Samuel slept upstairs. "You managed the estate well enough," Thomas said while cutting his meat. "I did what I was able to do," Evelyn replied calmly. "And that field hand," he continued, not looking at her directly. "He worked hard," she said, keeping her voice steady. Thomas placed his fork down slowly. "I do not like the way the boy looks at him. He is only a child, yet he looks at him like a father." The words landed heavy between them. Evelyn felt heat rise in her chest. "You left," she said before she could stop herself. The room became silent. Thomas lifted his eyes slowly. "Be careful." She lowered her gaze, but her voice did not tremble. "I raised Samuel alone. Isaiah only helped when it was needed." Thomas leaned back in his chair. "From now on, that man stays in the fields away from the house." Evelyn's stomach tightened. "There is no need." "There is every need," Thomas cut in sharply. "I will not have confusion in my own home." The next morning, Isaiah was reassigned to the far fields, the hardest stretch of land. Cold wind swept across the open ground. The soil was frozen and stubborn. The overseer watched him closely. By noon, Isaiah's hands were raw from the tools, but he did not complain. He understood what this meant. That night, Samuel cried and would not sleep. He kept calling Isaiah's name. Thomas heard it clearly. "Enough," he snapped, standing up from his chair. "This ends now." He stormed outside into the darkness. Evelyn followed, fear rushing through her veins. Thomas marched toward the quarters where Isaiah and other workers slept. Isaiah stepped out when he heard Boots approaching. "Yes, sir," he said respectfully. Thomas stopped just inches from him. "You have grown comfortable," Thomas said quietly, dangerously calm. "No, sir. My son calls your name in my house." Isaiah kept his eyes lowered. I never meant disrespect. Thomas studied him. Isaiah stood tall, strong, steady, not afraid, but not challenging either. That calm steadiness made Thomas even angrier. "You think you can take my place?" Thomas demanded. "No, sir." Thomas suddenly raised his hand and struck Isaiah across the face. Evelyn gasped from a distance. Isaiah did not fall. He did not strike back. He simply steadied himself. "I know my place," Isaiah said quietly. But Thomas heard something else in those words. Strength. The following weeks were worse. Thomas watched everything, every glance, every small moment. He noticed how Evelyn's shoulders stiffened whenever Isaiah passed in the distance. He noticed how Samuel's laughter grew louder when Isaiah worked nearby. Jealousy began to twist inside him, like a slow fire. One afternoon, Thomas called Isaiah into the main yard. Workers paused, sensing trouble in the air. "I have decided to sell you," Thomas announced. The words sliced through the silence. Evelyn stepped forward without thinking. "You cannot." Thomas turned sharply. "Watch yourself." Isaiah felt the ground shift beneath him. Being sold meant separation. It meant being sent far away. It meant never seeing this place again. But what hurt most was not the land. It was leaving them. "Why?" Evelyn demanded, her voice trembling. "He has done nothing wrong." Thomas looked at her with cold suspicion. "That is exactly the problem." Silence fell. Everyone understood what he meant. Thomas stepped closer to Isaiah. "You forgot who you are." Isaiah lifted his eyes slowly, not in anger, but in truth. "I remember who I am," he said. The quiet strength in his voice made the moment feel larger than it was. Thomas felt it, and he hated it. That night, Evelyn could barely breathe. She paced her room while Samuel slept. She made a decision she had carried inside for years. She went downstairs and found Thomas in his study. "There is something you should know," she said. He did not look up. "I am not interested in excuses." "It is not an excuse." He finally met her eyes. "The night you left," she said slowly, "you were not certain Samuel was yours." Thomas's face changed. "You accused me," she continued. "You said terrible things before you rode away." His silence confirmed it. "You left because you doubted me," she said softly. "Not because of business." Thomas stood abruptly. "Enough. You wanted distance," she pressed. "Now you return and punish the only man who helped your son survive." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Samuel is your son," she said firmly. "But he became strong because someone stayed." The truth hung in the room like smoke. Thomas turned away. For the first time, he looked uncertain. The day before Isaiah was meant to be taken away, Thomas stood alone in the yard. Isaiah was brought forward. Evelyn stood on the porch, her heart breaking. Thomas looked at Isaiah long and hard. "You think you are strong," Thomas said quietly. "I tried to be," Isaiah replied. "For her?" Thomas asked. Isaiah hesitated. "For the boy," he said finally. That answer struck deeper than any challenge would have. Thomas looked toward the house. He saw Samuel in the window, small hands pressed against the glass. The child was crying. Thomas felt something he had not felt in years. Shame. He had left. He had doubted. He had punished. And yet the man standing before him had protected what he had abandoned. Thomas's shoulders lowered slightly. "You will remain," he said at last. Gasps moved through the yard. "But you will keep your distance from the house." Isaiah nodded. "Yes, sir." It was not freedom, but it was not separation. Thomas turned and walked away without another word. Evelyn felt tears fall down her face, not from victory, but from knowing the storm was not fully over. Something had shifted in Thomas's eyes. Not forgiveness, not kindness, but understanding. And sometimes that is where change begins. After that day in the yard, the plantation grew quiet in a different way. Isaiah was not sold, but nothing returned to how it once was. Thomas kept his word. Isaiah remained in the far fields. He no longer carried wood to the house. He no longer repaired the porch railings. He did not step near the front steps unless ordered. Yet even from a distance, his presence was still felt. Samuel would sit by the window in the late afternoons, watching the workers in the fields. His small hand would press against the glass whenever he spotted Isaiah's tall figure moving between rows of cotton. "Papa," the boy once said softly. Evelyn heard it. Thomas heard it too, and that single word changed the air inside the room. Thomas tried to step into the role he had once abandoned. He walked through the fields with the overseer. He checked the books. He even attempted to spend time with Samuel, but fatherhood did not come easily to him. Samuel was shy around him, careful in his movements. The child would answer when spoken to, but his laughter did not come the same way. One evening, Thomas attempted to read to his son by the fireplace. His voice was stiff and unsure. Samuel listened politely, but his eyes drifted toward the window again. Thomas noticed. "Am I not enough for you?" he asked suddenly. Samuel looked confused. "I like when Isaiah tells stories." The words were innocent and honest. Thomas closed the book slowly. Across the room, Evelyn watched quietly. She did not smile. She did not speak. Inside, her heart ached, not with anger this time, but with sadness. Thomas had built his own distance, and now he could see it clearly. In the fields, Isaiah worked harder than ever, not to impress, not to prove anything, but because work was the only place he could place his thoughts. He had accepted the rules again. He had stepped back, but stepping back did not erase what had grown between him and Evelyn. They rarely spoke now. Sometimes when she walked near the edge of the property to check the orchard, their eyes would meet across the distance. There were no smiles, no hidden gestures, only quiet understanding. Isaiah's cheek still carried a faint scar from the night Thomas struck him. It did not fade easily, but he did not hold bitterness in his heart. He understood the world they lived in. Still, he could not ignore one truth. He had become part of that child's life, and that bond could not be undone. Late winter brought more than cold winds. Samuel fell ill. It began with a cough, then a fever. Within 2 days, the boy could barely sit up. Evelyn hardly left his bedside. She pressed cool cloths to his forehead and whispered soft prayers. Thomas paced the hallway outside the bedroom, worry carving deep lines across his face. The nearest doctor was miles away, and the roads were thick with mud from the rain. A messenger had already been sent, but no one knew when help would arrive. By the 3rd night, Samuel's fever rose dangerously high. Evelyn felt panic tighten her chest. "He is burning," she whispered. Thomas stood helpless near the door. From outside the house, Isaiah noticed the unusual stillness. He saw lamps still burning late. He saw servants moving quickly. He understood something was wrong. Against orders, he walked toward the house. The overseer tried to stop him. "You know you are not allowed." "I will not." "Step inside," Isaiah said calmly. "I just need to know if the boy lives." The overseer hesitated, then stepped aside. Isaiah stood at the bottom of the porch. Clara rushed out with a bucket of water. She saw him and shook her head softly. "He is not well," she whispered. Isaiah closed his eyes briefly. Then he said something unexpected. "There is a root that grows close to the South Creek. My mother used it whenever a fever climbed too high." Clara blinked in surprise. "Are you certain it will not harm him?" Isaiah said calmly. "It cools the blood and brings the heat down." Clara paused for only a moment before rushing back inside to tell Evelyn. A few seconds later, Evelyn stepped into the doorway. For the first time in many weeks, she looked straight at Isaiah. "Can you fetch it?" she asked quietly. Thomas stood just behind her, listening without speaking. Isaiah nodded once. "I will be quick." Without waiting for further permission, he ran toward the creek, disappearing into the dark line of trees. Thomas remained silent. Isaiah returned within the hour, his breath visible in the cold night air, small roots held carefully in his hand. He did not step onto the porch. Instead, he passed them to Clara. "They must be boiled," he explained softly. "Only a small amount." Evelyn gave a slight nod. "Thank you." Their eyes met for a brief second, longer than what was considered proper. Inside the house, the roots were prepared as instructed. A little was given to Samuel with care. Hours slipped by slowly. Near dawn, Samuel's fever began to fall. By morning, his breathing had grown steadier and calmer. Evelyn wept quietly with relief. Thomas stood beside the bed, staring at his son as though seeing him clearly for the first time. "He called for you in his sleep," Evelyn said gently. Thomas did not need to ask who she meant. Outside, Isaiah sat alone near the stable, waiting without being to. To wait. When Clara stepped out with a soft smile, he lowered his head in quiet thanks. The boy would live. That afternoon, something shifted inside Thomas. He walked slowly toward the stable where Isaiah was working. Isaiah straightened at once. "Yes, sir." Thomas studied him in silence for a long moment. "You knew that remedy would help." "My mother taught me," Isaiah answered simply. Thomas gave a small nod. "You saved my son." Isaiah shook his head slightly. "I only shared what I knew." Thomas glanced toward the house, then back at Isaiah. "I was wrong to believe strength belongs to only one man," he said in a low voice. The words were not loud or dramatic, but they carried real weight. Isaiah did not reply. He simply stood steady as he always had. Thomas hesitated before speaking again. "You may return to lighter work near the house when needed." It was not equality. It was not freedom. But it was something. And for a man like Thomas Carter, it was the closest thing to humility. As spring slowly drew near, the air softened. Samuel regained his strength. His laughter returned. And this time, when he laughed, Thomas tried harder to join him. He looked at Isaiah differently now, not as a threat, but as a man who had stepped forward when he himself had fallen short. Evelyn noticed the change as well. She did not rush toward Isaiah. She did not cross any boundaries, but there was comfort in knowing that truth had begun to settle inside the house. Still, the world beyond the plantation remained unchanged. Laws were the same. Chains had not vanished. And deep inside, Evelyn and Isaiah both understood that this calm might not last forever. But for now, Samuel was alive, and the house that once felt divided was slowly learning what it meant to stand together. Spring arrived gently that year. The frost disappeared. Green returned to the wide fields. The air felt lighter, almost full of hope. And inside the Carter home, something had shifted. Not loudly, not perfectly, but in a real and steady way. Thomas Carter did not become a different man overnight, but he was no longer blind. Since Samuel's illness, he had begun watching with clearer eyes. He noticed how Isaiah spoke kindly to the workers. He noticed how he never overstepped his place, never showed pride, never asked for praise. And he noticed something else as well. Isaiah had every reason to carry anger in his heart, yet he did not. That truth stayed with Thomas. One evening, as the sun sank low behind the fields, Thomas found Evelyn sitting quietly on the back porch. She looked peaceful for the first time in many months. "I have been thinking," Thomas said slowly, standing beside her. Evelyn glanced up, unsure of his tone. "When I left," he continued, "I believed distance would protect my pride." She said nothing, but all it did was leave you alone. The honesty in his voice surprised her. "I doubted you," he admitted, "and I punished others because of my own fear." Evelyn felt old wounds stir, but they no longer burned in the same way. "You cannot change what happened," she said gently, "but you can decide what happens next." Thomas nodded slowly. "I see now," he said, looking out across the fields, "that strength does not always come from control. Sometimes it comes from staying." They both knew who had stayed. A few days later, Thomas called Isaiah into the front yard. The workers paused again, but this time the air felt different, not tense, only curious. Isaiah approached calmly as always. "Yes, sir." Thomas held a folded paper in his hand. "I have made a decision," he said carefully. "You have shown loyalty to this house. You saved my son's life. You carried burdens that were never meant to be yours." Isaiah stood still, unsure of what would follow. "I cannot undo the past," Thomas went on, "but I can change your future." He placed the paper into Isaiah's hand. It was a legal document granting Isaiah his freedom. The yard fell silent. Evelyn stood on the porch, her breath caught in her chest. Isaiah looked down at the paper, then back at Thomas. "You are free," Thomas said quietly. "You may leave this place if you wish." Freedom. The word felt almost unreal. Isaiah had imagined it many times, walking beyond the fields without asking permission, making his own choices, building his own life. But now that the moment stood before him, his heart felt heavy instead of light. He looked toward the house, toward the porch, toward Samuel, who peeked through the railing with wide eyes. "I am grateful," Isaiah said softly. "Truly," Thomas gave a small nod. "You owe us nothing," he added. Isaiah hesitated. "I would like to stay," he said carefully. Murmurs spread among the workers. Thomas lifted an eyebrow. "Stay? Yes, sir. Not as property, not as debt, but as a hired man, paid fairly." Thomas studied him closely. "And why would you choose that?" Isaiah's eyes shifted briefly toward Evelyn, then toward Samuel. "Because this land holds more than pain for me," he answered honestly. "It holds purpose." Silence stretched between them. Then slowly Thomas nodded. "Very well. You will be paid wages like any free worker." It was not equality in the world beyond the plantation, but within these fences, something real had changed. Life did not suddenly become easy. The world outside still carried harsh truths. Not everyone approved of Thomas's choice. Some neighboring landowners whispered that he had grown weak, but Thomas no longer measured strength the same way. Isaiah moved into a small cottage near the edge of the property. For the first time in his life, he locked his own door at night by choice, not by rule. He worked the fields by agreement. He kept his earnings. He stood taller, not with pride, but with dignity. Samuel still adored him, but something beautiful happened with time. The boy began reaching for his father as well. Thomas made the effort now. He listened. He laughed more freely. He knelt in the soil to teach Samuel how to plant seeds. It was not perfect, but it was growing. One afternoon, Samuel ran between both men, holding their hands at once, one small hand in Thomas's, the other in Isaiah's. Evelyn watched from the porch. Tears filled her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. For years she had carried shame for feelings she never fully allowed herself to name. She had leaned on Isaiah when she was broken. She had loved him in a quiet and careful way, the way a heart sometimes loves what it cannot claim. But what she felt now was deeper than longing. It was gratitude. Isaiah had not tried to replace Thomas. He had simply stood in the empty space until it was filled again, and that made all the difference. One evening, long after Samuel had fallen asleep, Thomas approached Isaiah near the stable. The sky was painted in soft gold and pale pink. "I once believed you were my enemy," Thomas said plainly. Isaiah shook his head. "I never wished to be." "I know that now," Thomas replied. He paused before speaking again. "You loved this family without asking for anything in return." Isaiah did not deny it. Thomas let out a slow breath. "That is something I had to learn." The two men stood, awed, side by side in silence, not as master and slave anymore, but as men shaped by the same child. There would always be history between them. There would always be wounds that left marks, but there was respect now, and sometimes respect becomes the strongest bridge between broken places. Spring deepened into summer. The Carter plantation was no longer ruled only by fear. It was still part of a world that had not yet changed, but inside its fences, kindness had begun to grow. And sometimes that is how history shifts, not all at once, but one brave choice at a time. Years passed quietly on the Carter plantation. The land still stretched wide under the sun. The cotton still bloomed white each season, but the house at its center no longer felt cold. Samuel grew into a strong young boy with kind eyes. He learned to ride beside his father. He learned to work the soil beside Isaiah. From one man, he learned responsibility. From the other, he learned compassion. And from his mother, he learned strength. Thomas Carter was never a perfect man, but he became a present one. He finally understood that love cannot grow where pride stands guard. He faced his mistakes instead of running away from them. As for Isaiah, freedom did not change his heart. It simply allowed it to stand openly. He built his own future, one honest day at a time. He became proof that dignity does not come from status, but from character. And when people later spoke of the Carter family, they did not speak of scandal. They spoke of the season when a man returned home and discovered that the one he once tried to silence had become the very strength that held his world together. Sometimes the greatest courage is not found in leaving. It is found in staying and choosing to become better than you once were.